Hello, welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we'll be reviewing Pacifiction. On the French Polynesian island of Tahiti, the High Commissioner of the Republic and French government must investigate a persistent rumor, the sighting of a submarine whose ghostly presence could herald the return of French nuclear testing. Pacifiction is directed by Albert Serra. So Matt, I first approached you about Pacifiction because I watched it on a Tuesday night that you were away. I watched it, I fell in love with it. I was aware of it before, and it has this quiet hive of anticipation about it. There are some people that really love this movie, but it does not hit the mainstream in any way, even far outside of, say, like a film like Tar. Tar, for instance, has this critical analysis and critical love. Everyone that watches Pacifiction seems to, from the critical community, seems to have a pretty high opinion of it, but it hasn't penetrated the conversation at all. So I've been talking to you about this movie, I've been talking to my friends about this movie for a long time. I finally showed it to you, and I'm just curious what you think of it.
I think it's very interesting that you brought up Tar because I think a movie like Tar very much lives in the details, and its themes are very much lurking under the surface of that film. In Pacifiction, I see a lot of similarities between the two.
I do too. I was thinking about this earlier, actually.
I'm sorry to disappoint you in this regard, but I thought a lot of these aspects of these details, weaving themselves throughout the film and the themes, I don't feel as well came together as they did in Tar. And there's a few things that I will describe throughout this review in more depth about why that is. Did I love this movie? No. Did I like it? Yes. I do think this is a movie, with the exception of the cinematography, which I thought was absolutely fantastic and I can't wait to talk more in detail about. I thought this movie was sort of forgettable to me.
Interesting.
And I'm sorry for that because I know this is like your favorite movie of the year, so I apologize. But I am excited to talk about this movie because there's a lot of details that I do find worthy of conversation, which I'm very excited to talk about, and I love that this movie does allow for that conversation. So I'm excited to get into those details.
Well, why don't we start with what you liked about the movie?
What I liked about the movie the most was the cinematography. I thought the cinematography was absolutely amazing. I don't know the film stock they used, but something about the cinematography reminded me of old films, like the first films that were done in color. It's very hazy, the light is very diffused, it almost feels very photojournalistic. It looks so immaculate, and just the amount of shots that they took in golden hour with this beautiful pink sky, it was absolutely insane. It was definitely the best thing about the film that I would remember from it is just the cinematography, because it's absolutely amazing.
I would say that what captivates me so much about this film is its themes and its characters and how ambiguous all of those things are, how ambiguously these characters go about the plot. For instance, I think we're fairly kept in the dark as to exactly what's going on, exactly who knows what is going on, and to what degree they're complicit in it and to what degree they're catching up with it. That's one of the things I find so interesting about the film is I think it's very intensely and intricately layered to have various interpretations about where the characters are within the plot and how complicit they are in it occurring. I think the film is very well shot. I think it's gorgeous. I think it's edited very intricately. But I don't think that any of those things would matter at all without the themes of the film, and there are various themes. But the beauty of the cinematography to me gets more to the theme of the ugly underbelly of a tropical paradise. So this film is a simmering, intense thriller. It's a film that's never truly suspenseful, but it always feels just like a little bit icky and a little bit uncomfortable. And I think the film is really getting at this idea of colonialism or maybe late capitalism, or the idea of a smaller country trying to make these big moves to be a superpower, and the effect that can have on a tropical paradise, the effect it can have on a natural landscape that's gorgeous and part of the identity of these countries. I think that's what I like so much about it. I think the cinematography is very intentionally gorgeous because the film is getting at quite the opposite.
I do agree with that, and touching on that a little bit, it reminds me of the opening shot of this movie, which takes place showing a bunch of shipping containers on a ship, and in the background are all the beautiful mountains of the French Peloponnesians because of how beautiful the landscape looked, but it was ruined almost by this foreground shot of these shipping containers, which just looked terrible. It almost reminded me of just the effect that man have on the beauty of the world itself. That actually carried out throughout the film.
Certainly.
That I noticed there was a lot of shots where the foreground elements were all humanistic qualities, things that humans made and built. And everything in the background was just this beautiful landscape that I thought was being drowned out by all the politics going on the island.
Yeah, the main character drives a white Mercedes. I feel like where this white Mercedes is put is actually fits very nicely into what you're talking about. It's always parked against like this beautiful tropical setting and these trees, rain coming down on the white Mercedes. Obviously, rain is a very naturalistic setting for the film. I think it very much has in mind the idea of colonialism and man intreading and maybe interrupting to some degree the natural process.
What I was enjoying so much was just the undercurrent of all these themes. And unfortunately for me, what I thought was that the film became too overt about those themes and explaining them later on in the movie in a way that I thought kind of ruined what I was feeling about it earlier on. I think there's two sequences that I could allude to in pertaining to that. There was one scene with our main character. He plays this political liaison. What he goes through is this internal monologue that he's saying out loud in the Mercedes with this other guy in the car.
This is the scene I'm thinking about, yeah.
Yeah. And this scene was actually magnificent. I really thought it was a fantastic monologue. It really did explain everything that I think the movie was already describing, but just in such a blatant way that I didn't quite like, even though I liked the monologue itself, if that makes sense. I really liked the scene, but I don't like how it fit into the rest of the movie because I think it just too clearly explained the movie. There was a scene right at the end. The ship guy, why am I getting this? Like, what is he? Is like
the general?
Oh yeah, the general captain.
Yeah.
He is going back off to a ship, and he basically tells all the men, "Tonight is the night that it all comes together."
If there's any scene I don't like in the movie, it's the very last one. Even though I think there's a lot about it that's very elegantly shot, like the final sequence where it's on the person's face who's going to ultimately sacrifice themselves, who's moving into the red water. I like all of that. I actually disagree with you pretty fervently on the scene in the Mercedes. And the reason is, so I've seen this film 4 times. I've watched it from a different point of view every time because I do believe that you can watch this as like a David Lynch fever dream. I think you could watch it as that. I think you could watch it as a political chamber piece where almost similar to Oppenheimer, but like far more subtle and less bombastic, that you have all these different egos colliding in a room at one time. I think that that monologue is certainly some of what the film is about, but I also think that it's uniquely about his point of view. And the only reason that I say that is because his growing irrelevance in the film forces him to become more egotistical in the car, especially when he's alone. And he was like, I'm going to go in the nightclub, this dark nightclub. He talks about how politics is a nightclub. He says, I'm going to turn all the lights on and I'm going to point to these people one by one and tell them who they are. And then not even 10 minutes later, it's raining. He's walking around a football field and suddenly the lights come on and he's in the light while other people are looking at him and seeing who he is. So that's why I actually find that scene so effective, not because it's a didactic scene that says, here's what the film is about, but it's a character piece that shows he's actually part of the thing that he thinks he's against.
I don't know what else to say. I understand where you're coming from, for sure.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily feel like the scene hit me in the same way.
There's like a growing apocalyptic tone to that scene that I really like, where he's just like, everyone will rot in their tombs. And like, that's just like the stuff I live for in movies. Yeah. Just that like uber cynical monologuing. Beyond just my thoughts about it, I do think that it has a growing relevance in the film.
When you said the whole, it's like a fever dream, I really do agree with that. There's these wonderful sequences that do take place in like a club. Every one of the characters that's involved in this story is in the club. And you get these little details or information about them by the way they're interacting with other people in the club, which I found very interesting. It was one of my favorite things about the film in the first 40 minutes. There's a scene towards the end of the film where we have that happen again. And like you said, he basically says he's going to go in there, he's going to turn on the lights, and he's going to make this big stink and whatever to get to the heart of everything. Of course, there's that moment in the field where all the lights come on, but then we see him in the club later on, and he chooses not to do that.
Yeah.
I liked that. I liked how it went from the monologue in that sense, him saying that, to him not actually following through. I thought that did enough for me, but I get what you mean. That would be like a very Jeffrey scene.
The first time I watched it, I didn't quite make that connection. I just knew that it was raining, he was wearing a suit, and there was a wonderful soundtrack. There was just that little keyboard, boop. And it felt very unnerving to me, and I felt very captivated by it, but I didn't quite understand what it meant.
The movie has a lot of those ominous moments.
Yeah, if you're somebody who really enjoys just an ominous set piece, just this general feeling of unease in a film, this is 2 hours and 50 minutes of that, and I love that in film. I do think there's quite a bit more going on than just the tone, but the tone of the film is what first got me in love with it. And then as I started looking further into it, I found more to love.
And going back to what you were describing with his character, it was one of the things I didn't quite settle into the movie with was these characters. I think they were a little too cleanly drawn for me, whereas in Tar, there was a lot of dynamics happening, and there were so many different ways in which you could perceive Lydia Tar's character.
I think there's a pretty essential question about him that the film leaves unanswered. I think it edges in one direction, but ultimately, did he know about the potentiality of nuclear testing before somebody brought it up to him? I think the main question of his character. I've watched the film 4 times, and there's evidence in both directions. I would say there's a little bit more evidence that he doesn't know, but watching it in those 2 different perspectives yields a very different experience watching the film, which I think is really interesting. I agree with you that there's perhaps not as many character details. There are some, like for instance, I think his growing irrelevance has to do with the way that he dominates people in his personal life. He does a lot of little things. When he's in the club, he asks people, someone will bring him a beer and he'll say, oh, can you pour it in a glass for me? Things like that. He becomes really possessive of a trans character in the film.
Yeah.
A trans character who he thinks is kind of under his wing, finding out information for him. But the way that she interacts with some of the other men he takes issue with or interrogates her about, I would say to you that it's far more opaque, certainly far less structure than Tar is. That's for sure. But I do think there are things to dig into a little bit.
So on that note, in a certain way, there was a character in the movie that I wasn't able to really pick up on, and hopefully you can help me with this. There's a character that is overlooking him a lot of the time where he is not aware that he's being watched. In the baseball field, he was very prominent.
Yeah.
He was very prominent when he went to visit that abandoned resort, and he was standing right there in the window, right in front of him, and he didn't even notice him. Obviously, that is very intentional. They're placed there, but I'm trying to figure out what the meaning of those scenes were, or who that character was, and why they were placed there.
Well, there's certainly no explanation of who that person is.
Oh, okay.
That person is part of like a growing coalition that is trying to oust our main character. There's that scene, I think, in the abandoned place where he was talking about he's going in spirals. Let's make sure that it's a downward spiral instead of just him moping around sort of thing. But we don't know what he is or why he's involved. I kind of like that because I think the film has this general sense of conspiracy and a general sense of unease and paranoia that I like.
He is very paranoid.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of like 70s conspiracy thrillers around the time of Watergate.
There's a lot of shots that are just stagnant, and other than that, the only time the camera moves would probably be a pan.
Yeah.
That actually mimicked a lot of 60s movies, I think, for me, in terms of the colors and all that.
I will say something that's kind of interesting is you talked about the film being too clearly drawn in its final acts. And I actually found it to be more darkening and unsettling in its final act. It's a film that seems to be leading to somewhere and leading to answers. And then it's like a 30-minute nightclub scene where people are dancing in the dark. It just seems really abstract and strange. And I think the film becomes stranger as it goes on, with the exception of the last like 3 minutes. Again, if you're somebody who's into mood, if you're somebody who's into the simmering tension that builds to not a whole lot, this movie's probably for you. It's not for everybody.
This movie is definitely not for everybody.
Yeah, this movie's definitely not for everybody. I think I'm echoing somebody else that said that you could recommend this to 100 people and maybe 5 of them would say that's the best movie I've ever seen. The other 95 wouldn't click with it. This isn't to say like, because I love this movie, I'm smarter than you or something. I think this movie has a very particular vibe, a very particular feeling that you're either going to tap into or you're not.
When this movie first ended, I was just like, you asked me how I felt, and I was like, I don't know.
Yeah. But I thought that was a fair enough answer. Yeah.
It was one of those things where I felt like I needed to ruminate on, and maybe I still don't quite know how I feel about it in a general sense. I think there are aspects of it that are very immaculately well done, like I was describing the cinematography, and I think the acting was very good. Maybe it's just not my mode.
So you're ready to go to grades?
I am ready to go to grades. I give Pacifiction a B. It's just pretty much in the
Works
middle
for me.
of everything that I wasn't too sure about it and everything I liked about it.
Well, I give it an A. That's probably obvious. I heard the filmmaker Christian Mungiu. He's the director of Beyond the Hills and 4 Months, 3 Weeks, 2 Days. A great Romanian filmmaker. They were interviewing him on the Big Picture podcast, and they always ask somebody, what's the last great thing you'd seen? And he talked about Pacifiction. Christian Mungiu, in his own right, is a very experimental, very interesting formalist filmmaker. But he talked about Pacifiction, and he said, we need people who are just pushing the language of film in different directions. And when I watched this film, I felt like the language of film was being communicated in a new way. And again, that has a lot to do with the mood, quote unquote, and the vibe, quote unquote, of the film. But there is something about its cinematic language that I haven't quite seen before. It's a strange film to review, and it's going to be even a stranger film when I talk about it in my top 10 later, and I'm just like, I probably will have so much to say about all the films in my top 10 and then still be a little dumbfounded by this one. But the fact that I'm so dumbfounded by it is why I love it so much. It feels like a mysterious whole, and for somebody that watches so many films, I don't often feel this enigmatic about films. So that's what I like so much about it.
I think there were a lot of choices that were made that were outside of the grain. And some of those I could point to in terms of this movie were the sequences that took place in the club. They were actually very quiet for being in a club. There was a little bit of background music, but you didn't hear, like in a club, you would hear talking and loud music. And this was quite the opposite. People weren't really doing much in the club. There wasn't a lot of motion or commotion. I think about that more particularly with the final club scene. It's almost like everybody is completely silent and they're just looking at each other. It was very bizarre and very strange, but it did really set that mood and that tone that you were talking about. There was also another scene that we didn't quite get to. It's when the main character goes out on the ship, on his little boat, to try to find the submarine.
Towards the end, yeah.
Not quite scared me, but had me at like uneasy.
Especially with his light shining against the darkness. Yeah, it's a creepy scene.
And they kept that going for so many minutes. I'm like, what is going to pop up? Like, it's not that type of movie where something's going to pop up. The way they built that tension was really well done, that I was just like one hand over my eye, like trying to not see whatever was going to happen, even though nothing happened.
And that's actually a good metaphor for this movie.
It really is.
Yeah. And that's it for a review of Pacifiction. Pacifiction is now available to rent on VOD. Certainly let us know what you think in the comments, because it's a film that warrants a lot of discussion. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you next time.